Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome to Chapter 11, Diet and Health. Before we get started today, we'll just go over some housekeeping stuff. For Exam 2, I've corrected all of your grades, so make sure you go into NYU Gradebook, check that grade, and if it's incorrect, make sure you email me and let me know so I can make adjustments. I think I have all of them, but there were a handful of people that never emailed me, so I'm not entirely sure. Uh, with the release of this PowerPoint, I've released information for Exam 3, which is going to be on Friday, May 15th at 4 p.m. It's basically going to be the same exact thing as Exam 2. You're going to go on to NYU classes and take it, and we'll pray this time that we don't have any grading mistakes, but if we do, we'll just undergo the same procedure to make sure we get them right. For the diet analysis project, Part B, I'm in the process of grading right now. I have about 25 left as of making this video, so hope to be done with those by the end of the week. For that, if you have mistakes, I am making comments on your Word document and reattaching it with your assignment. If you get a perfect score, in most instances I'm not attaching the assignment because I had no comments. And if you gave me a PDF, I'll make comments in the little comment box on assignment, so you should be able to see it there. Just like I released information about Final Exam 3 with the release of this video, I'm also releasing information on Diet Analysis Project Part C. It's going to be a 1.5 to 2 point page response about a nutritional deficiency, and it's going to be an optional extra credit assignment. So you have a chance to earn up to 6 points, and those 6 points will be added to your lowest exam score, or if you have some kind of other outstanding low score. I'll just go through your gradebook and figure out where the best place to put it is going to be. So that should be it, and we'll go ahead and we'll get started with diet and health. So Chapter 11, Diet and Health, should really be called Diet and Disease, I think, since that's what we're going to talk about. Before we move forward, I'm just going to get my laser pointer. So our learning objectives today, we're going to start by outlining the relationship between malnutrition and disease. Then we're going to dive into the concept of risk factors and their relationship to disease. Then we'll cover two main diseases. We're going to look at cardiovascular disease, which is going to take up the most time. It's the #1 killer in the United States, with the exception of right now, unfortunately, with COVID-19. I think that's taken its place temporarily as the #1 killer. It surely won't stay that way. Then from heart disease, we're going to move into the relationship between diet and cancer. And then we finish up with just a few slides. We don't go into very much detail here, looking at complementary and alternative medicine. So we start out with a brief introduction of diseases, and our diseases are generally categorized as infectious or chronic. And I'm sure over the last few months, all of us have become familiar with what an infectious disease is with the current crisis in our world. So infectious diseases are caused by bacteria and viruses. They are easily transmitted from one person to another, like we know with COVID-19, through cough, sneeze. Some examples include pneumonia, influenza. Those are ones that we're still infected with today, and many people die each year from them. Other ones, such as polio, measles, tuberculosis, these were things that affected a high number of people in the past, but those numbers are much smaller now thanks to vaccinations. Up against infectious disease, we have what are called chronic diseases. These are illnesses that progress slowly and are long in duration, and they also lack an immediate cure. So these are things we're looking at when we talk about heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease. And as we know, a lot of these things, they don't typically arise from one thing, but usually a combination of things. And we call those things risk factors, and they can include inheritance, such as your genetics, your lifestyle choices, and other conditions, such as environmental conditions. In the US, we have moved from a society riddled by infectious disease to one plagued by chronic disease. And obviously, the exception to this would be what's going on right now as we're making this. Or as we're doing this chapter, it's the one time in our lifetime that this has been the exception. And our country here in the United States, at least, has not been riddled by an infectious disease like COVID-19 in quite some time, long before any of us were born. So, but generally, we are a country that is riddled by chronic disease and not infectious. We can look at the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. Number 1 is consistently heart disease. Number 2, cancer. 3, chronic lung diseases. Then we move down: strokes, accidents, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, kidney disease, pneumonia and influenza, suicide. And then here we have diet-related, alcohol-related, and other causes. So these are the ones that are directly related to diet, or risk of heart disease, risk of cancer, diabetes, strokes. And I think we can make an argument that things like kidney disease can be related to diet, since one of the major causes of kidney disease would be diabetes and heart disease or hypertension. We know that nutrition status has an impact on our ability to fight off infectious diseases. So pneumonia and influenza can be related to our nutritional status in some way. And then there is, loosely, very loosely, and still ongoing investigation about the relationship between our nutritional status, our diet, and our mental health. And many suicides are related to that, obviously. At this time, just in a brief 1-month window, we'd probably see COVID-19 taking over these. Now we talk about the relationship between nutrition and disease. We're looking at a bidirectional relationship, which means that malnutrition and disease worsen each other. And we saw this same type of relationship in the last lecture when we talked about physical activity and nutrition, right? Aspects of physical activity affect the way nutrients are handled in our body, and what we eat also affects the way our body is able to perform. So with malnutrition and disease, we have this ribbon. So at the top, you either start with malnutrition or disease. Once you have one of those, it impairs your appetite, digestion, absorption, and overall metabolism. Once you have impaired appetite, digestion, absorption, and metabolism, that's going to further impair your ability to eat, which is going to lead to further impairment of nutritional status. As your nutritional status worsens, you're going to have weakened immunity. That's either going to expose you to new diseases, or it's going to worsen the disease that you already have, and it continues to spiral downward and downward with further malnutrition and disease. So this ribbon is a good way to symbolize how malnutrition or disease, or malnutrition and disease, affect one another. Now we can look at the relationship between the immune system, nutrition, and disease. And as we've seen in this class, numerous nutrients have roles in immunity. So with nutritional deficiencies, it can decrease the size and number of immune cells that we have, and this will make our body become more vulnerable to infectious diseases. Some deficiencies affect our immunity more than others, and this is going to depend on the physiological role of the specific nutrient and the degree of deficiency. So, example, vitamin K, we know the primary role of vitamin K is to assist in blood clotting. A deficiency of vitamin K is not going to have as big of an impact on our immune system as something like vitamin D. Vitamin D plays a role in the production and maintenance of various immune cells. So when we have a vitamin D deficiency, it brings down our immunity. As for degree of deficiency, this just alludes to the fact that the worse a deficiency is, the bigger impact it's going to have. And I think that's pretty clear, right? If we have a mild deficiency of something like vitamin D, it's not going to cause immediate concern. But if it's a severe deficiency, then it's something that can be more impactful. Excesses of nutrients can also impact immunity, especially when that excess nutrient affects the absorption of another. So we've seen at various points in this class how nutrients can compete for absorption in the digestive tract. An example that we have is calcium and iron. So if you consume too much of one nutrient, it could block out the absorption of another, and then that can contribute to a deficiency. And this is not something that we're going to see with normal intake of a balanced diet, but it can occur if somebody is taking very high supplemental doses of a nutrient. We do have certain groups who are at risk for malnutrition. This includes the very young and the very old, the impoverished, and the hospitalized. So once somebody becomes malnourished or they have malnutrition, that's going to increase their susceptibility to infection and lead to longer hospital stays. And the longer your hospital stay is, the more likely you are to have decreases in muscle mass, more likely you are to have the development of things like pressure injuries, and the more likely you are to become infected. So when somebody becomes malnourished, it has large implications for their ability to get out of the hospital and get back on the track to recovery. This is a chart from our textbook with some selected effects of malnutrition. So you can see malnutrition affects the skin, so it affects the thickness of the skin, the elasticity, and reduces the connective tissue. So this makes you more prone to having cuts, and once you have cuts or abrasions on your skin, the more likely you are to have an infection. Malnutrition negatively affects the digestive tract and other body linings, so it not only affects things like antibody secretions and the number of immune cells, but it's also going to affect the ability of the digestive tract to break down and absorb nutrients. Lymph tissues, which we've talked about in the context of fat absorption, lymph tissues are home to our immune cells as well. And so when we have malnutrition, our lymph tissues are reduced in size. And then just as a general response, when we have malnutrition, the amount of time it takes for our immune cells to function is prolonged, and the amount of immune cells circulating in our bloodstream is reduced. So these are just general effects of malnutrition, and in most cases, specific nutrient deficiencies are going to have specific effects, and they're going to come with their own signs and symptoms. And we've seen a lot of these specific effects, signs, and symptoms in our lectures on vitamins and minerals. So these are some of those specific nutrients and selected roles. So we don't need to go through all of these here. We've seen them throughout the course, but I've already talked about this one, vitamin D. So it plays a role in immune cell function and production. Vitamin C and E, we've talked about as antioxidants, so they protect against oxidative damage. Let's see if there's any others. Protein, we've talked about as being an important component of the skin, especially with its ability to participate in the skin and also in the synthesis and function of organs and cells of the immune system. One more slide on the immune system for now. When we talk about the immune system and chronic disease, the word inflammation also often comes up. And when we hear inflammation, whether it's circulating on the internet or in social media, it's usually represented as a bad thing, right? We don't want inflammation. You want to reduce inflammation. But that is not really the case. So inflammation is a natural immune response. This is going to be induced by infection or injury, and it's very important to maintaining health. So inflammation is our body's way of recognizing that something is wrong, and it is the reaction to help manage that issue. So with this natural immune response, this is something that we call an acute inflammatory response, which can be helpful and life-saving. Chronic inflammation is not desirable. So this is when the inflammation is long-lasting, and that long-lasting inflammatory state can harm the tissue. It can also lead to chronic diseases and worsen those that are already existing. And the last point is that both acute inflammation and chronic inflammation are going to present unique nutritional challenges. So for something like acute inflammation, if somebody gets into a car accident and is really banged up, their body can go into acute inflammatory response, and this acute inflammatory response is going to lead to a rapid breakdown of muscle tissue and fat tissue, to the point that it's going to be almost impossible to feed them enough to break down, to avoid the breakdown and loss of significant weight. On the other hand, chronic diseases, things like HIV, AIDS, certain types of cancer that are going to be quite inflammatory, those are going to present more long-term nutritional challenges. And so while something like a car accident is going to lead to rapid mobilization of fat tissue, muscle tissue, and lead to a fast breakdown and fast weight loss, these other diseases are going to lead to long-term increases in the amount of calories that somebody needs to maintain their weight. And so in those cases, people end up losing significant weight due to failure to be able to meet those nutritional demands. All right, this brings us to our concept of risk factors, and it acts as a segue as we go into learning about heart disease. So, what is a risk factor? Well, a risk factor shows correlation with the disease. This means that a risk factor often occurs with the disease, and they are a candidate for the cause of the disease, but it's not for certain. Now, I know in our textbook, when they talk about risk factors, they use an example about different fires going on throughout the city. And at each fire, the same guy keeps on showing up at the corner. So that guy that keeps on showing up, it doesn't mean that he set all those fires, right? It could just be a coincidence that he's there, but he's a suspect, right? We're suspicious about that guy, and we think that maybe he did it. So that's what risk factors are. They show up alongside the disease, and they're candidates for the cause of the disease. If we think about something like heart disease, maybe we'll say smoking is a risk factor for heart disease. Obesity is a risk factor for heart disease. High cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease. You can see how that goes. We have 3 categories of risk factors. The first one being genetic. So the example being that both parents have type 2 diabetes means that you will be at an increased risk of having type 2 diabetes. Environmental risk factors would be something like having exposure to secondhand smoke. Right? It's in your environment that you live in. And then the last one, behavioral risk factors, and the example here would be a sedentary lifestyle. So what you do. So the same environmental and lifestyle factors may contribute to several chronic diseases. I use smoking as an example up here. Now, smoking is not just a risk factor for heart disease, but smoking is also a risk factor for cancer and also a risk factor for COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So this is lung disease, emphysema, or chronic bronchitis. So one risk factor can contribute to several chronic diseases. And we can see how that looks on this chart from our textbook. So we can see that a diet high in saturated and or trans fat can be a risk factor for cancer, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries, obesity, stroke. See, diet's low in fruits and vegetables, pretty much the same, but it doesn't check the box for hypertension. Some other, one thing of note, right? Diet high in added sugars. Notice how type 2 diabetes is not checked off. That's something that we covered in the first part of our class. And these are other risk factors. So age, as we get older, our risk of getting all these things goes up. Our genetics checks the box for all of them. Smoking and tobacco use is going to check all of them except for, I would call this one into question. I think there has been a connection between smoking and type 2 diabetes risk. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd have to look into it. But clearly smoking does not serve as a risk factor for obesity. This is another chart from our textbook. I think it's from our textbook. That shows a relationship between risk factors and disease. So you can see that obesity is a risk factor for diabetes. Once you have diabetes, that serves as a risk factor for atherosclerosis, or the hardening of arteries. And when you have atherosclerosis, that leads as a risk factor for hypertension. And you can see how they're all connected. So diabetes not only increases risk of atherosclerosis, but also increases the risk for hypertension. And overall, the point is just to show that the central problem of obesity is going to be interrelated and create this web with all different risk factors and different diseases. So how do you estimate your own risk? There's a couple ways that you can do this. One of the first things that you want to do is explore your family's medical history. So it's important to have an understanding of your parents' medical condition, grandparents' medical conditions, aunts, uncles, to see what may run in your family. Because as we've seen, what runs in your family is certainly going to have an impact on what you're susceptible to. You could also get a series of laboratory tests, and this is something that is encouraged for all adults, at least on a yearly basis. So you should have your blood pressure checked. You should obtain a lipid panel, which is a measure of your cholesterol levels. As an adult, it's good to get a hemoglobin A1C blood test. And what a hemoglobin A1C is a measure of blood sugar control over the past 3 months. And there are certain parameters that are set to tell somebody if they have pre-diabetes or if they have diabetes. You also get a complete blood count. This is a blood test that is going to look at your different blood cells and see if you are at risk for anemia or if you have anemia. It could also help to identify some genetic blood disorders. And then lastly, genetic testing, which for most things is not a perfect test, but there are certain genetic testing that can be done to help determine your risk of certain diseases. And here we have this table about family medical history. These are all conditions that have a genetic component. So some people are surprised that alcoholism has a genetic component, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, liver disease, and bone disease, osteoporosis. All right, we made it to cardiovascular disease. So as I said in the beginning, this is going to be the disease that we spend the most time talking about, and the main reason being it has a strong connection to our nutrition and our lifestyle, and also because it's the #1 killer in the United States. And I think this summer, one thing I have to do is to start getting an understanding of some Asian cultures because after this semester, I had so many of you guys, which is a great thing. I'm not complaining. It's an amazing thing how many international students we have in our class from China. China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, South Korea, just all over that part of the world. So much of our class is focused about what happens here in the United States. It might be a good idea for me to get an understanding of the recommendations and some of the statistics in that part of the world. So cardiovascular disease is disease of the heart and blood vessels, and it claims nearly 1 million lives here in the United States each year. So it's the #1 killer. For a long time, cardiovascular disease was thought of as the man's disease, that it mostly found in men, but that is not true. It's actually the leading cause of death among women too. So it's not just a man's disease. One of the big problems with cardiovascular disease is that the heart is one of the least regenerative organs. And so we have some organs, namely the liver, that if the liver is injured, it is able to regenerate, regrow, and heal itself. Well, the heart is not so lucky, so that when there's a cutoff of blood supply, oxygen supply to the heart, and that heart is damaged, it does not heal well. It heals by forming scar tissue. Symptoms of a heart attack and stroke include pain in the jaw, chest, neck, arms, or back. It can also include weakness, lightheadedness, and shortness of breath. So anytime you have significant symptoms such as this, or you have a loved one who's experiencing them, and they are someone who's considered to be at risk of having these things, then you should pay close attention and seek medical attention. So I've already mentioned atherosclerosis a number of times. This is hardening of the arteries, and it's at the root of most forms of cardiovascular disease. Every adult has signs of atherosclerosis. The real question is, how advanced is it? And also, what can we do to slow it down or reverse it? So by the time we become adults, we have some kind of sign of plaque formation or hardening of our arteries, but depending on our genetics, depending on our diet, depending on our lifestyle, is going to determine how advanced it is. And what can we do to slow it down or reverse it? We can have lifestyle interventions. I just mentioned plaque formation. So this is going to be the buildup or hardening that's going to lead to something like a heart attack or a stroke. And we'll see what that looks like on the next slide. But this is the process that happens to lead to plaque formation and atherosclerosis. So it starts with damaging factors to the blood vessel lining. So we have our blood vessels running throughout our body, and there's some kind of damage that occurs to it. So assault on the cells can occur from that high LDL cholesterol that we've learned about. It can result from high blood sugar. It can result from hypertension or high blood pressure. And so when that assault on the cells occurs, it's going to stimulate an inflammatory response. So immune cells are going to come to the site to try to heal and fix that damage that occurred. Well, unfortunately, when that happens, the immune cells can get trapped in the blood vessel lining. And once they become trapped, then the cells are going to harden or mineralize. And it's going to build up and start narrowing the blood vessel. So this is the process we just talked about. This is the blood vessel. We can imagine that this orange part is not here. It's a normal blood vessel. So there would be assault on the blood vessel lining. Immune cells would come along to the site of the damage. The immune cells would get trapped, and then over time they harden and it starts building up, and this is what we call plaque formation. So as you can see, as it builds up, it starts narrowing that blood vessel. And when that blood vessel closes is when we get something called a heart attack. Or if it happens above the heart, it's going to lead to a stroke, which is a cutoff in blood supply to the brain. So we get this buildup of plaque, and the plaques can rupture. So when they rupture, the blood is going to clot. And we have two kinds. We have something called a thrombus. This is when the plaque ruptures and the blood clots right here in this area and cuts off the blood supply here. And then we also have something called an embolus. And this is where the blood is going to clot here, but instead of clogging the blood vessel here, that clot is going to continue along until things get more and more narrow, and eventually it's going to clog up the blood vessel. And so this can happen. You can have a blood clot in your leg that's going to be an embolus. It's going to travel up towards your heart until it gets to a point where it's too narrow to pass through. And that's how a blood clot can turn into a heart attack. So both of these can cause heart attack or stroke. Another thing that we have is an aneurysm, and this is going to be caused by plaque and blood pressure. So there is a buildup of this plaque. This is going to increase the blood pressure because the blood has to pump harder to get through this small area. Because of that increase in blood pressure, it's going to put increased stress on the blood vessel wall. And with that increased stress, you can get weakening and ballooning of that blood vessel wall. So as it balloons out, it gets this round shape that you see here, and eventually that can burst. Now when those burst, it's a serious life-threatening, very, very serious life-threatening event. And a common one is the abdominal aortic aneurysm, and that's the one pictured here. So when this happens, clearly you're going to have massive internal bleeding. Risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Some are what we call non-modifiable risk factors. Those are things like our age, our sex, and our genetic inheritance, right? We can't change them. So age as a risk factor is different between men and women. For men, once somebody becomes 45 years old, then they are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And for women, the threshold is 55 years old. Another risk factor, and also with this, men are at increased risk. Women consider lower risk, even though it is, the sex just has to do with the difference in years. I think, yeah. If I come back and decide I want to change that, I'll let you guys know. Another risk factor, LDL and HDL cholesterol. So we've already seen this. The higher the LDL cholesterol, the greater the risk. And these are the most atherogenic lipoproteins. So the LDL, what we call the bad cholesterol, are most prone to contributing to atherosclerosis. A high HDL actually reduces our risk of cardiovascular disease, and we've seen that we can increase our HDL through physical activity. There is some nuance to talking about LDL, that not all LDL are the same and that there's differences in size and density. This is a point of contention amongst researchers and is beyond the scope of our practice, but I think it's worth mentioning that there is some controversy when it comes to LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. And the last one here on this slide is high blood triglycerides. So if you have high triglycerides, that is considered a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The risk factors continue on. Hypertension is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And it's worth noting that hypertension and atherosclerosis worsen each other. So as our blood pressure goes up, it makes atherosclerosis worse. As we have atherosclerosis, it makes our hypertension or our blood pressure worse. Diabetes is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Physical inactivity is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Smoking is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And the guidelines for smoking are don't do it, and hitting the Joule might not be a whole lot better. An atherogenic diet is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and this is a diet that is high in saturated and trans fatty acids and or high in refined sugars. And then the last one, obesity is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and so is something called metabolic syndrome. And what metabolic syndrome, it's a combination of risk factors, and these include high fasting blood glucose, central obesity, that apple shape, hypertension, low blood HDL, and high blood triglycerides. And the parameter set here is that if you have 3 or more of these, then you have metabolic syndrome, and that leads to a significant increase of cardiovascular disease. And these are the recommendations for each of those. The one that you'll want to know for this course is that the guidelines for central obesity is done through waist circumference, and that would be 35 inches for women and 40 inches for men. So once you have a waist circumference that's greater than 35 for women, you're at increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and for men it's 40 inches. All right, so this is just a summary slide for those risk factors, and we've already gone through each of them. These are some of the standards for the risk factors that we have. Let's see, the ones that you really would need to know. You should know the stratification by body mass index, or BMI, which we did in the last exam. The other ones, this is all good information for you to have, but I'm not going to be testing you on any specific numbers for them. Recommendations for reducing cardiovascular disease risk. So this can be accomplished through lifestyle changes, increases in physical activity, striving for the physical activity guidelines for Americans, which we learned in our last lecture, and you should be very familiar with for the final exam. Weight loss, if it is warranted and achievable, right? If somebody is overweight or obese, and they are consuming energy in excess and it's possible for them to lose weight, then a 5 to 10% weight loss may be helpful to reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Obviously, dietary changes, we can replace our solid fats with unsaturated fats with using the example of switching butter for olive oil. Choosing more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and legumes, and fewer packaged and prepared foods, and cutting back on alcohol consumption, 2 drinks per day or less. The final one, reducing exposure to tobacco smoke and nicotine. So not just cigarettes, but also nicotine is what we call a vasoconstrictor and leads to increases in blood pressure and strain on just the blood vessels. And that's what we're going to find in our Joule. How much does changing the diet change LDL cholesterol? Well, if we reduce our saturated fat intake to less than 7% of total calories, it can lead to an 8 to 10% reduction in LDL. If somebody is overweight or obese and they can safely lose 10 pounds, it can reduce LDL by 5 to 8%. And if somebody introduces 5 to 10 grams per day of soluble fiber, they can reduce their LDL by 3 to 5%. So say we have somebody who has high LDL cholesterol, they consume too much saturated fat, they're obese, and they don't consume enough fiber. If we get them to cut back on all 3 of these things, then we can lead to a significant reduction in their LDL. All right, so we talked about hypertension before. We're just going to go over a couple slides on hypertension now. Hypertension is high blood pressure. So hypertension is one of the most prevalent forms of cardiovascular disease. It affects an estimated 78 million adults, and it's often asymptomatic, meaning you have it, but you don't know you have it, right? Because it's not, your body isn't going to tell you that you have it. So it's often called the silent killer, and it silently worsens atherosclerosis. Hypertension is characterized by elevated blood pressure. So these are the parameters. Normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. Hypertension is 140 over 90. And pre-hypertension is anywhere in between. Risk factors for hypertension include age, genetics, obesity, salt intake, alcohol, and overall diet pattern. So some of the modifications to reduce blood pressure: weight reduction, again, if it's achievable and warranted. The DASH eating plan, which is the main reason I brought this hypertension slide into here, is to talk about the DASH eating plan. And this is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And this is a diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, low-fat milk products with reduced saturated fat intake. And it is the #1 recommended diet overall when they do this U.S. News, whatever health report each year. The DASH diet plan is usually #1. Sodium restriction, so cutting back on overall sodium intake can help to reduce blood pressure. Physical activity, performing aerobic physical activity can help to control blood pressure. And of course, having moderate alcohol consumption. So this is our DASH diet, and it's nothing real special. It's just a well-balanced diet that includes foods from all groups. So, and it is classified by the servings per day of different things. So 6 to 8 servings per day of whole grains, 4 to 5 servings per day of vegetables, 4 to 5 servings per day of fruits, 4 to 5 servings per week of nuts, seeds, legumes, less than 6 servings per day of lean meat, poultry, fish, less than 5 servings per week of sweets, and 2 to 3 servings per day of healthful fats and oils. Now, if you're interested in seeing what the different serving sizes look like, then you can use this chart. So it gives you an idea, right? When we say 6 to 8 daily servings of grains, a serving would be 1 slice of bread, 1 ounce dry cereal, so on and so forth. All right, so that is it for our heart disease section. Now we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition and cancer. And the reason why we cover cancer in this lecture is that it's the second leading cause of death in the United States. There's been a small but steady decline in death from cancer, and this is thanks to the early detection methods and improved treatment methods that help to catch the cancer before it becomes deadly, or to treat it before it becomes deadly. So prevention of cancer is the key. Even though the search for a cure for cancer is exciting and also necessary, and that's where all the money goes to, preventing the cancer from happening in the first place is what we want to achieve. There are certain lifestyle factors and environmental exposures that can increase or decrease the risk of developing cancer. Just to look at how cancer develops, right? So this is going to be a very simplistic explanation of how cancer occurs and how it becomes deadly. But there must be some kind of exposure to a carcinogen, which is a cancer promoting substance or chemical material, whatever you want to call it. There has to be entry of that carcinogen into the cell. Once it gets into the cell, it's going to initiate cancer by damaging or changing the cell's genetic material. Right? It's going to act on the DNA and cause DNA damage. Once it does that, there's going to be something called promotion that's going to stimulate the cancer cell's growth. So the cells are going to multiply out of control with that damaged DNA. So you get multiple cells that are going to have the damaged DNA. As the cells multiply, they're going to take over the tissue where they occur. And once they've spread far enough, then they are going to travel by the blood or the lymph to other tissues. And once that occurs, we call it metastasis. So obviously when this occurs, there's a disruption of our normal body functions. We can see how this occurs, right? We have our normal cells here. We have a carcinogen that's going to invade the cell and damage or change the DNA. That cell is going to rapidly multiply with the damaged DNA. So those damaged cells are going to start taking over the tissue. As they continue to divide, they're fully taking over the tissue here, and this is what we would call a tumor. And once those cancer cells fall off into the bloodstream, they can travel downstream and get into other tissues, and that's what we call metastasis. So once this occurs, and this occurs especially, metastasis is when cancer becomes deadly. So the goal, of course, is to catch it at early stages and treat it. Which factors affect cancer risk? Obesity is one. This is going to depend on type of cancer and other factors. Just 2 types of cancer that I understand are related to obesity or have been connected to obesity would be breast cancer and liver cancer. Physical activity is another factor. So physical activity not only helps to aid in weight maintenance, but also helps to maintain the correct balance of hormones. And then alcohol consumption and smoking These two can be a direct irritant to the GI tract, and of course, smoking is a direct irritant to the lungs. So, with alcohol consumption in the GI tract, people who are chronic alcohol abusers certainly going to be at increased risk of things like mouth cancer, esophageal cancer, stomach cancer, colon cancer. Anywhere that alcohol is going to pass through can cause damage. Other factors affecting cancer risk, so very high temperature cooking and smoking of meats can be damaged when we expose our food to very high temperatures, and especially direct flames. That can change the characteristics of the components of our food. That can be carcinogen promoting. There's been shown an association between processed red meats, things like beef jerky, Slim Jims, hot dogs, sausages, and the development of things like colon cancer. We also have things that are going different food components that are going to reduce our risk of cancer development, and that would be fiber-rich foods, so our whole grains, our legumes. Intake of folate has been shown to be protective against cancer. Intake of calcium has been shown to be protective against cancer. And of course, intake of antioxidants and phytochemicals has been shown to be protective. Now, calcium, right, we do find it in some vegetables, but certainly things like antioxidants, phytochemicals, folate, fiber-rich foods, this is showing us that plant-based foods are protective against the development of cancer. Some recommendations and strategies for reducing cancer risk. So these are steps that consumers can take to minimize carcinogen formation during cooking. So trying to limit that exposure to direct flame or very high temperature. One thing that you can do is marinate meats before cooking and roasting or baking them in the oven. So that marinade serves as a barrier to the actual food and the ability of the temperature to change the components of the food. When grilling with an open flame, lining the grill with foil or wrapping the food in foil to expose that to eliminate that direct exposure, and then taking care not to burn foods. And this is hard to do, not only just from a practical standpoint, right? We're not all the best cooks, but I like some burnt foods. They taste good. And this is a summary slide about recommendations for reducing cancer risk, and this comes directly from your textbook. So, achieving a healthful body weight, being physically active, consuming adequate plant-based foods, minimizing alcohol intake, paying attention to the processing of our food and the preparation of our food, and relying on food rather than supplements to meet our nutrient needs. All right, so we've gone through heart disease, we've gone through cancer. Now we just have a couple slides about CAM, which is complementary and alternative medicine. So just briefly, complementary medicine is we're going to have our standard treatment methods for a disease or a medical condition, and we use complementary to help and assist those standard treatment methods. Alternative medicine is where we're not going to use the standard treatment methods and we're going to try something different. So when we talk about CAM, we talk about herbal medicines, including cannabis or marijuana, and things like acupuncture. The United States government does have the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. This is a subsidiary of the National Institute of Health, or NIH, and they are responsible for reviewing the effectiveness and efficacy of different complementary and alternative medicines. And they've provided support for acupuncture as a complementary treatment, but they have not given strong support for very many other treatments. So there are some concerns with complementary and alternative medicine, especially when it comes in the context of herbal medicine and different herbs, right? They can be mislabeled, which is the same issue that we learned with dietary supplements and the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, or DSHEA, which you guys should know. And then we also have issues with drug-nutrient interactions. So if somebody is receiving medication, standard treatment for a medical condition, and then they're also trying to take some kind of herb or herbal medicine on top of it, it can result in dangerous drug-nutrient interactions. The example, ginkgo biloba is a popular herb that people will use for a number of reasons, and it interacts with the blood thinner called warfarin. And so these two things taken in combination can have undesirable effects. So if you are receiving medication, standard treatment for a medical condition, and you're interested in doing a complementary treatment with that, you should always run it by your physician first. So with any complementary or alternative medicine, we always want to stratify it by our risk and benefit. And so this can help us to do it. We look at the ideal situation, so benefits with little or no risk. This is where something like acupuncture may fall in the ideal situation, right? It might help us, and there's very little risk in doing it. Then we also have cautionary situations and neutral situations. Cautionary is going to be where we have possible benefits with great or unknown risks, so we should consider carefully. We have the neutral situation, which is there's going to be little or no benefit with little or no risk. This is probably where marijuana is going to fall in most instances. And then we have our dangerous situation where there's no benefits with great risk, and the example could be that ginkgo biloba with our warfarin. So as I said in the beginning, really just short on complementary and alternative medicine. It's not an emphasis of this course by any means, but there is just a small part in this chapter of the textbook, so I figured I'd throw a couple slides in here. These are a list of different herbs that people are using for things, and you can see that as you go through the evidence list, which I'll allow you to do on your own time, there's not very good evidence for most of them. And they also can come with some risks. So I'm not an expert by any means in these different herbs and stuff. I have more of a traditional education in nutrition and medical nutrition therapy. So I'm not someone who is recommending these things to people or talking about them very much, but it is an area of nutrition, medicine, health that some people are very passionate about and believe in very much. All right, the last slide. This was one thing in our textbook that I thought was kind of cool. So we have our woman here who is shielding herself from all of our diseases, both infectious and chronic. So our viruses, COVID-19, our hypertension, atherosclerosis, obesity, and what she's shielding it with. She's shielding it with attention to food safety, moderate calorie and salt intake, adequate nutrients, high in vegetables, little in alcohol, whole grains, low saturated and trans fat, high fruit, high in fiber and fluid. So it's just an image to show the importance of nutrition and being physically active in the prevention of diseases. All right, well, that is it. So if you made it this far, you know that there was no extra credit added to this lecture, and I'm sorry for that. But if you go back, you do the chapter previous to this, you will see that there's 2 points available in that lecture. You combine that with the 6 points that are going to be available with diet analysis part C. And so before the end of the semester, you still have 8 points available to you to get extra credit. So if you're interested in doing that, go ahead and do it. And if you are someone who has done excellent in this class so far, then you can just go ahead and cruise towards the end of the semester and put your focus towards your other courses. I hope everyone is staying safe. I'm trying to, but we'll see. And have a good one, guys.